So thank you for inviting me to the conference. I want to talk today about inequality and the zero lower bound. This is joint work with Joel Marbe, who was at FEMFI and is moving to the Bank of Spain. I don't know if this has happened already or it's happening on September the 1st. Galo Nuño from the Bank of Spain, but now is visiting Basel, and Omar Rachedi at ESADE. I was going to make a joke about ESADE, but you will not get it. Anyway, so thank you. You look at a time series of real interest rates in the US economy, but that will be pretty much the same in any other advanced economy. And what you see is a secular decline over the last 30 years. Now, this decline became particularly acute after the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, and the slow recovery, and later during COVID. Now, of course, we have gone through a little bit of an inflation spike. The inflation spike seems to be abating, and my forecast is that it's likely that the low interest, real interest rates are going to be prevalent for the next decade or so. And that means that with very low real interest rates, the nominal rate, which is the real interest rate plus inflation, is going to often hit the zero lower bound. And we know that the economy behaves at the zero lower bound in a very different way that it behaves out of the zero lower bound when we have some sorts of nominal rigidities. Most of the work at the zero lower bound has been done since the pioneering work by Egerton and Mike Woodford within the context of models with representative agents. And the natural question is to ask, well, will the heterogeneity across households matter or not for how the economy behaves at the zero lower bound, and in particular, how you want to think about monetary policy in that situation? And in that paper, what we are going to argue is that, yes, that's in fact the case, that household inequality matters. So if you're a central banker, you may care absolutely zero about inequality from type of a normative perspective. Okay, you may say, look, inequality is great, citing Wall Street, greed is good. But even in that particular situation, you still need to understand the degree of inequality in your economy, because it will matter for the consequences of monetary policy. Is there a way I can move this up? So what are we going to do to make this point? We are going to take a hunk model, and we are going to tie down our hands by using a very standard hunk model. Now, it's not that I fully agree with everything in the model, in the sense that if I were going to have the freedom to design my own hunk model, I may do things in slightly different ways. But I want to play the following game. I want to play the game of, let me take the hunk model you will see this week at Jackson Hole conference, and just add to it the zero lower bound and solve it fully non-linearly and see what happens. So in that way, I'm as close as possible to the benchmark, except that we are looking at the zero lower bound, and two, that we are using a deep neural network to solve for the full nonlinear dynamics. What we are going to see is that the zero lower bound is going to imply three channels that are going to change the way in which the central bank can operate. The first one is what we are going to call a deflationary bias channel or mechanism. And that comes also in models with representative agents. Basically, when you have shocks that push inflation high, the central bank can stabilize them, because you can always raise the interest rates. But when you have shocks that push inflation down, you cannot fully stabilize them because you have the zero lower bound. That means you are going to have deflations more often than you would like to have, and you are going to have inflations or periods of high inflation the number of times you want to have them. That's why you have a deflationary bias. And that's going to lower the real interest rate on average. And I will try to argue and show you how that happens. But second, there is also going to be a precautionary savings mechanism due to idiosyncratic risk. And if you remember, you changed presentation on Tuesday, was it? He already hinted at that. In standard Ayagari models, the presence of idiosyncratic risk makes households to save more. By saving more, you accumulate more capital that lowers the rate of return on capital. But that lowers the real return on assets, and that pushes the economy closer to the zero lower bound, given one inflation target. And the third channel that you are going to have is that there are going to be precautionary savings due to aggregate risk. Why is this the case? Because I'm worried both about my idiosyncratic shock, but I'm also worried about the aggregate shock that I know that the central bank cannot fully accommodate due to the zero lower bound. And that means that this is a model, this doesn't seem to be working, that is going to have non-neutrality in the long run. So that's quite interesting because the model doesn't have, it's very easy to come up with non-neutralities, putting like non-standard assumptions. But this is a Hank model. This is a truly standard, I can go to Washington and no one will cast me into the darkness of hell because I'm writing this model. And yet...
They would 2 years ago. 2 years ago.
2 years ago, they may have done that. But the interesting thing is that this is a model where the inflation target determines how often we hit the zero lower bound. And depending on how often we hit the zero lower bound, there is going to be more or less precautionary saving, which means that we will have more or less higher or lower real interest rate. Okay, so this is a model where there is non-neutrality. Now, of course, the issue is to measure the extent of this non-neutrality. According to this very standard Hank model, with a very standard calibration, we are going to find that a combination of changes in the trend inflation in the economy and increases in household inequality is going to account for 21% of the drop in the real rate over the last 30 years. Okay, so this is not all the story. We are not saying there may be other things like demographic changes or globalization, the savings glut, anything like that. Those may be important out there. We are just saying that the way in which we are conducting monetary policy may explain what I think is a relatively important chunk of this deal. And again, remember the rules of the game. It is not that I design a model and a calibration that will maximize how much the interest rates will be reduced by changing monetary policy. That's why I was tying down my hands. And you will see, for instance, in the calibration, a couple of calibration targets I would really not recommend my students to follow, but they are the calibration targets that people in the literature follow.
Quantitative economics.
Exactly.
Quantitative.
Exactly. There is a lot of great papers before us, but I'm not going to have the time to go over them. So let me tell you the model. We have a discrete time, infinite horizon, a sticky prices economy with household heterogeneity. In particular, households are going to be ex ante identical, but exposed, they have high idiosyncratic productivity shocks. And they are going to choose consumption, they are going to choose bond holdings, and they are going to choose labor supply, subject to a borrowing constraint, in the ways that Chris and many other people argue is a reasonable way to think about how people make decisions. In terms of firms, we are going to have final good producers in the very standard way where they just are perfectly competitive and aggregate the intermediate good producers which have monopolistic competition power. And we are going to have nominal rigidities. I will tell you in a second why we picked that form of nominal rigidities.
Yes. Very quick comment.
Sure.
You do not need a borrowing constraint.
Yes, and then with a zero
borrowing constraint to get these results.
Yeah,
it is
with a zero
necessary.
Yeah, with a I know. Just
I know, but
I try to simplify.
I
Yes.
know.
Anyway,
People will, yeah.
and then to get the economy to the zero lower bound, we are going to follow the trick of Cristiano Eichenbaum Rebelo of a big demand shock, a preference shock that pushes us over there. Okay, so households. The households are maximizing the expected discounted utility, and beta is a discount factor, and we are going to have a shock. Now, the only thing that is different is that we are using GHH preferences. Why are we using GHH preferences? Later on, I'm going to make changes in wealth inequality in the economy. And changes in wealth inequality may have labor supply effects. I want to filter out the consequences of those changes in wealth inequality by shutting down the wealth effect channel. And GHH doesn't have a wealth effect. I could do this perfectly with a standard utility function. The results are pretty much the same. The area is a little bit more difficult to interpret because of the wealth effect. In terms of the budget constraint, households can consume and can invest in bonds, and then they get some wages. The wages are subject to the stochastic shock SIT and their labor supply HIT. And there is going to be a function, a taxing function, that is going to be redistributive through a progressive taxation income. Then they get the rate of return, the nominal rate of return from their previous savings, be RT minus 1. I transform it into real return divided by inflation, and then we are going to have the profits in the economy lump sum rebated to them. Now, I'm going to do something slightly different, but that I actually think makes a lot of sense, which is in the standard Hank model, everyone gets the same share of the profits in the economy. That doesn't make any sense. Poor people don't get any profits from the economy. So what I'm going to do is that the profits that you get depend on your labor supply shock. That means richer people, in terms of high labor supply, are also people getting more profits from the economy, and you will see later how this is going to play a little bit of a role. There is going to be an aggregate preference shock. As I was mentioning before, it's going to follow an AR1 process. The idiosyncratic productivity shock, again, following the standard practice, is going to follow a Markov chain. And I think I pretty much say everything else. With respect to the final good producer, very simple. It just takes all the intermediate goods. The intermediate good producers have a linear production function, again, like in the standard Hank model. And the only thing that I'm going to do slightly different is that instead of having Calvo, I'm going to have Rothenberg. Why Rothenberg? Because again, I'm going to change the inflation target. And by changing the inflation target, when you solve the model fully non-linearly, you also change the level of the economy when you have Calvo. Okay? So Calvo is really tricky because, you know, what people like about Calvo that is very easy to solve, it is true when you are linearizing the model around the steady state. But if you are doing the full non-linear solution, you have a change in the levels when you change the inflation target, and I don't want to have that change in the levels because, first of all, I don't think it's empirically true. Okay? By doing that with Rothenberg, I get rid of that problem, and of course, I will calibrate my Rothenberg parameter to give me the same results that I would get with a standard Calvo model. Now, in terms of monetary authority, the central bank is just going to follow a standard Taylor rule, except that it has a 1. I'm doing everything in gross rates because I think that the zero lower bound is a little bit easier to understand. And basically what is happening over there is I'm going to look at the central bank, I look at inflation, I look at deviations with respect to my target, I look at the output, I look at deviations with respect to the deterministic steady state of the output, and I decide what to do with my nominal interest rate. But if I get to 1, I cannot go below 1. Okay, very good. As I mentioned before, the fiscal authority is going to raise progressive labor income taxes to finance a fixed amount of outstanding debt. And that's the way you introduce assets in this economy. So if you remember, in the way you can think about this with heterogeneous agent models, there is like 3 ways to do it in general equilibrium. One is assume that the net position of all households is 0, which is the original Imoroglu paper. You can assume there is some fixed amount of debt and the agents hold that debt, which is the way in which Rao Ayagari did it in like one of the first papers. And then you can think that actually capital is endogenous. I'm going to shut down the capital accumulation process. kind of makes things a little bit easier, but if you want later, I can tell you a little bit what happens if you put back capital. And the government is just going to balance its budget constraint, basically raises all this revenue to pay for the taxes, to pay for the service of the debt. Okay, in terms of closing the model, the labor market clears, the bond, yes.
Quickly backwards. This is not a model in which the government balances its budget in every period, or?
Yes, period by period.
Okay, that's a huge, that
Yes.
makes a huge difference.
Yes, so we have a follow-up paper, which is called Endogenous Taylor Rules, where the government actually, it's okay, where the government actually doesn't balance period by period. It changes the level of the debt. And what we argue is that that gives you yet another channel that is going to change the real interest rates. Yes. Okay, but we wanted to make the point in two different papers because otherwise it will be, but you are 100% right, and that's 100% the introduction of the follow-up paper. Okay, no, for sure, and people don't get that. Even if you don't fully buy the fiscal theory of the price level and you don't become like a Cochrane fan, it's still the case that you're 100% right.
Makes a huge difference, and people shouldn't just skip over where they are.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's just that I wanted, again, the way I'm thinking about this research project is doing like partial derivatives, one little step at a time, and then like
That's the right way to do it.
Yeah.
But emphasize the.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. We should make that a little bit clearer in the presentation. The bond market's clear and the resource constraint of the economy holds. Okay. So going to the calibration as you know, like the meta view of what we are in a faculté de lettres. So I think that here we can say things like the meta narrative. So the meta narrative of this paper is to stick as much as we can with the standard practice. So we are going to target an inflation of 2% and an annualized. That is going to imply picking our time discount factor of a 1% real rate in the deterministic steady state, which again is kind of the average. If you look at things on the return on risk-free bonds after World War II, we are going to match the volatility of demand shocks to reproduce a 10% frequency of the zero lower bound. We take that directly from Commion et al. And then we are going to take the idiosyncratic risk calibrated to match two observations. The first is that there is going to be a 30% share of borrowers in this economy. I didn't mention that fully before, but the households have a borrowing constraint, but they can go negative. This is not going to be a situation where they cannot borrow at all. And there is going to be a 10% average marginal propensity to consume. And we take that from the Parker et al. And Johnson, Parker, and Sulels. And again, as I was saying before, it's not that I'm particularly married to any of these two numbers, and I'm more than happy to consider other values. The aggregate liquid wealth in the economy is going to be around 25% of annual GDP, and this is kind of some concept of net government debt, where you take liabilities minus assets. And again, there is a lot of discussion exactly about how to measure that. I'm just taking the numbers of Kaplan, Moll, and Violante, which is what people seem to be taking these days.
The distribution of liquid wealth matters a lot.
Yes.
You're just matching the aggregate level. The distribution matters a lot, and emphasize that.
Yeah, fully agree with you. And that was precisely at the very beginning of my talk when I said there is going to be things of this calibration I don't like. That's one of the things of the calibration I don't like.
Yes.
Okay, but again, remember, I'm just trying to do exactly what everyone is doing. So I'm not trying to add anything new. And then we can go and start unpacking all these extra layers and see what we will get over there. And then tax progressivity, again, we take it from Heathcote, Storrs-Letten, and Violante, and the Rothenberg cost equivalent are equal to a Calvo parameter that yields a 1%, a 1-year price duration. Those are the numbers of the calibration, but let me not go in detail over it. Now,
all of them matter, though.
All of them matter, yes. It's just in the a lot. Again, the only point is this is a orthodox calibration. This is the calibration. You will go to the Board of Governors, and you are not going to bump into anyone who will be very unhappy with that calibration. Okay, and hopefully the referees are not happy either. Anyway, now, this is a model that is fun to compute because it's heterogeneous agents, you have a zero lower bound, and you have aggregate shocks. So how are we going to do it? For all of you who had to endure me already on Tuesday, you know that the approach I'm going to follow is exactly what I described on Tuesday on detail. Okay, I'm going to summarize the distribution using some features, and then I'm going to parameterize the law of motion of those features into tomorrow with a deep neural network. For those of you who were not in my presentation on Tuesday, the idea is that a deep neural network can map to any desired degree of accuracy a very highly nonlinear function, and it's relatively easy to train that neural network. And that's what we are going to do in this overview. We are going to follow in particular the algorithm that is outlined in my recent Econometrics paper, and what you can get over there is the loss of motions for the different endogenous objects, and in particular for the perceived inflation in this economy. And if I had a little bit more time, I will try to convince you that in fact, there is a lot of nonlinearities over there, that really taking the nonlinear aspect of this model seriously matters. But perhaps the easiest way to think about it is the following. Imagine that you don't do deep neural networks. Imagine that you do Crucell-Smith, okay? And I compute the model with Crucell-Smith, and agents within the Crucell-Smith economy are trying to forecast inflation tomorrow. And what you see over there is that, for instance, for all simulation errors, all simulation periods, you have the red distribution. And the red distribution is what happens with Crucell and Smith. It's not even centered at zero. So you are not even having a biased forecast. However, as soon as you use the neural network, you have the blue distribution. You are now centered at zero and have a much higher accuracy. So you go from 98.83 to 99.94. Now, if you come from micro, you are like, oh, come on, going from 98 to 99 cannot make such a big difference. But this is kind of the agent deviation with respect to what will be the full rational expectations. It actually does matter. These things kind of accumulate over time, and I have a paper on that at the Review of Economic Studies. And it actually, this 1%, this last 1% matters.
Yes, okay. It's hugely important. Yeah. Quantitative.
Yes, quantitatively it matters.
Quantitative.
Okay? So don't bring your intuition from micro, where, you know, I have had I have written a fair number of papers using data panel where I say things like my R square is 0.1 success, and you're like, oh, come on, this is 0.98. How important can it be to go to 99? Yes.
Yeah, so maybe you will talk about that, but in your current model, what do you exactly take it? Because there is no capital, liquidity is constant. So what exactly you do the process with?
Oh, we are actually doing. We are predicting inflation and a term related to inflation expectations from the Neo-Keynesian Philip scheme.
So what is my summarizing variable for the distribution?
The summarizing variable is going to be the interest rate, because the interest rate encodes a little bit the consequences of the distribution.
So one summarizing moment when forecasting the inflation.
Very good. But look at, this is really interesting, coming back to my point. Now is when you're trying to summarize inflation when you are at the zero lower bound. And now the linear, the R square, is only 81%. Okay, that's really pretty bad. And however, when you are doing with the neural network, you are still over 99%. So the neural networks really make a huge difference over here in capturing the full nonlinear distribution. Okay, so let me tell you then the consequences for the economy, and I'm going to tell you first about the macro consequences of the zero lower bound, and then the micro consequences of the zero lower bound. So in terms of the macro consequences, again, you are going to see there two distributions. The first one is the ergodic distribution for a regular Hank model. So what do I mean by ergodic distribution? Is I simulate the model 1 quintillion times and I just show the distribution. Okay? And I do the same for a model with the zero lower bound and without the zero lower bound. So without the zero lower bound is kind of a counterfactual wall where the central bank can lower the interest rate as much as it wants, the nominal interest rate. And what you can see is, again, using the same red and blue, that the blue, which is the wall with zero lower bound, inflation tends to have more mass at the left. Why? Because this is a bank, a central bank that cannot stabilize inflation when the demand shocks are very bad. And that generates deflation. And it's also a wall where it means that the real interest rate is going to be lower. And it's a wall where we are going to have over here, you see that aggregate consumption over there? The very, very bad events. It's the tail event. We have a very bad shock, a very bad demand shock like in 2008, and you cannot fully accommodate it because of the zero lower bound. You can also see the same if you look at the impulse response functions. These are the generalized impulse response functions, if anyone cares. And basically what I'm going to show you over there are the impulse response functions for 4 cases. We are going to do the case for the zero lower bound Hank model with a 1 standard deviation shock, and for the 3 standard deviation shock, and the same without the zero lower bound. So what happens when you have a 1 standard deviation shock? That the model with and without the zero lower bound deliver the same result. Why? Because the central bank has enough room to accommodate that shock. The difference comes when we have a 3 standard deviation shock, and that will be second panel, second row, first column. And you can see how the central bank with the zero lower bound gets stuck, cannot lower the interest rate more. And that basically means that you have a much bigger drop in wages, you have a much bigger drop in output, and you have the real interest rate actually goes up a little bit. Why? Because you have deflation, but the nominal interest rate is stuck at 0. Okay? This is important. Wages suffer a lot at the zero lower bound. Okay? So I remember when people ask me, how can this be true? I always remind them about 2009. If you're in Spain in 2009 and you want to remodel your bathroom, it's the best time ever. So my mom remodeled the bathrooms at our home back in Madrid in 2009. And she said, I will call contractors at 8:30, and 8:35 they will be at the door. Okay? That's what it says. The European Central Bank cannot accommodate the negative shock. Wages go down a lot. Okay? In general, the way you want to think about this is that the zero lower bound skews the dynamics of our model to the left relative to the standard Hank model. When this happens is when the zero lower bound constrains. But of course, what I'm going to try to argue, this sounds very obvious, what I'm going to try to argue is that how often it constrains is going to be endogenous. So, kind of I need to go to the second step of the argument. And all these dynamics are absent in the standard Hank model. And I can also show you the consequences at the micro level. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm showing the consequences in terms of income at impact at the 10th percentile of wealth and at the 99th percentile and at the aggregate. And as you can see over there, and the diamonds are kind of the average, and the columns, like the different colors, represent the change in the composition in changes in different incomes. And you can see that both the poor and the rich households lose a lot because wages go down, profits go up a little bit. That's a feature of the neo-Keynesian model, that when the economy is not doing that great because of nominal rigidities, profits actually go up a little bit, and that increases the income, and also there are some endogenous responses of taxes and interest. And in particular, the guys who are making a good time out of it are the rich people. Why? Remember, there is deflation, but the interest rate, the nominal interest rate is fixed at 0, that basically means that the real interest rate is high. Okay? Bob Hall told me once that his father, who was also a professor of economics at Stanford, remembered the 1930s as the best time ever. Why? Because he was a tenured professor. Stanford didn't cut any wages during the 1930s and didn't fire any tenured professor. Prices went down 30%. For Bob Hall's father, the real wage went up 30%. That's the effect of those holding a lot of bonds over here. Wow. So the point I'm going to try to make over here is that the zero lower bound alters the distributional effects of a recessionary shock. And that in particular, the zero lower bound amplifies the drop in total income because the central bank cannot stabilize the economy, but it particularly amplifies the drop in consumption for wealth poor households. Okay, so that, yes.
Like in this model, right, we have the zero lower bound, right, that causes more inflation. There is, if we end up at it, right, but if we are go to that pricing, the price changes eat up resources, how important in that model is that?
So I didn't mention that in the interest of time, but in this model, we are considering the cost in util terms, not in resources. So we don't have that channel. The point I'm trying to make is that the zero lower bound has redistributive effects, and that you need to think about these redistributive effects because they matter for your monetary policy, even if you don't care about the poor. Even if I'm a central banker who hates the poor, I still need to know that the poor suffer more because that will affect their endogenous responses to my decisions as a central banker. Yes.
Is that mostly driven by the assumption that profits go to households based on the income shock?
Part of it is yes, but that's not the main chunk. The main chunk is the poor do not have any assets.
Yeah. Right.
So the fact you cannot smooth, first of all, you cannot smooth consumption. I mean, it's double jeopardy. The wages go down, which means you cannot, and you don't have assets to smooth. And second, you don't get the extra interest rate, real interest rate from the assets that you don't have. Those are the two main things over here.
But you don't have assets because
you are poor. That's the definition of being poor.
By definition, poor.
Yes, poor means you don't have assets. Yeah.
I think this is a good assumption.
Yeah.
But it's not common in the hate laws, right?
Well, he's not.
It's not common to allocate the profits based on the.
No, it's not.
No. But as I was saying, quantitatively, the allocation of profits, the profits could be taken by a third part. This is an economy where the firms could be owned by someone outside the economy, and I will still get the same point.
Right.
Okay.
But assuming the poor people get a bunch of money
Yeah.
when the economy goes into a recession, makes a big difference, and you're not allowed to just wave your hands and make crazy assumptions like that. Quantitative.
Yeah, I know, and this is an economy where being poor at a recession is bad. Okay, so you go to to West Philadelphia, a recession hits, they get low wages or unemployed, they don't have any assets. Believe me, you go through West Philly and you will realize that those people do not have any assets, and they don't get any profits from the economy. None of them have a lot of shares on Amazon.
That's why social insurance is a good idea.
Yes, exactly, and that's what we are going to get into that in just 1 second. Okay, yes.
Question about this assumption, firms paying people based on labor shocks.
Yes.
Would something break if they paid people based on financial wealth, like the way that they do it in
We could do it in that way. It's just that it gets a little bit of a mess computationally, and it will not matter that much. Okay, because rich people really, at the end of the day, in this model, rich people are also the financial wealth, the financially rich. Like the high labor income are also the financially rich. So quantitatively, it will make like an epsilon difference. Okay, so let me show you in terms of the numbers, since I'm running out of time, how this will compare. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the CLB hunk, the hunk, and the rank. And for those of you who are not aficionados to this area, rank means the representative agent neo-Keynesian model. Okay, and just to make this table fit in one slide, we don't have the rank model, which is representative agent without the zero lower bound, but we computed and in the paper is there, okay? So you have representative agent plus the zero lower bound, heterogeneous agent plus the zero lower bound. So you can do any type of comparison that you want. Also, I'm going to look at the deterministic steady state, and I'm going to look at what we call the stochastic steady state. Other people call it the risky steady state. And again, for those of you who are not aficionados in this area, the stochastic steady state means this is an economy where there are aggregate shocks, but they happen to have a realization of zero in this period. And we are in the fixed point implied by that. But people understand there can be shocks tomorrow. While in the deterministic steady state, there are no shocks, aggregate shocks, and people understand there will never be aggregate shocks. And what you can see over that is, first of all, there is a non-trivial difference between the deterministic steady state and the stochastic steady state in zero lower bound hang. And that matters. And the reason why that matters is because in the deterministic steady state, the zero lower bound is not binding. And since there are no shocks, you are never going to be there. But in the stochastic steady state, it matters because even if the shock today is zero, I understand I can have a shock tomorrow and I'm acting preventively against it. And since I'm running out of time, let me summarize. I have a bunch of slides, but let me summarize it very quickly, what is going on. I'm the household and I need to save more because, first of all, I have idiosyncratic shocks. That pushes down the real interest rate. And I need to save more because I know that if there is an aggregate shock, my wages are going to go down a lot. That's the aggregate of precautionary saving against aggregate shocks. These two together lower the real interest rate. And by lowering the real interest rate, fix an inflation target means we are going to hit the zero lower bound much more often. Which means that people will save more because they are more worried and so on and so forth until we get to the fixed point. Okay? And what we do in the rest of the paper is to show two ideas. Idea number one, if it happens to be the case that the monetary authority, for whatever the reason, lowers the inflation target, that means we are going to hit the zero lower bound more often, which means that people endogenously is going to save more, which it means you are going to lower the real interest rate, which means we are going to hit the zero lower bound more often. So surprisingly enough, if you are targeting a very low inflation target, you generate more hits at the zero lower bound, even more than you were looking for.
Right.
So you overdo it.
Right.
You overdo it. And that's why we have been overdoing it for the last 15 years.
Right.
And second, when you increase income inequality in the economy because there is more idiosyncratic uncertainty, people save more to cover themselves against that idiosyncratic uncertainty, which means we hit the zero lower bound more. So this is, I guess, a very simple environment where caring about the micro aspects of the economy is absolutely fundamental.
Right.
You really want to know what is happening at the micro level of the labor market quantitatively to determine what your quote unquote optimal inflation target is.
It's probably 3, not 2.
Yeah, exactly. And then, we argue that under certain circumstances, this can be quantitatively quite important.
Yeah.
So our story is not that everything about the real interest rate is changes in micro volatility, and it's not that everything is changes in inflation target. There are other forces that we fully acknowledge. We just say that quantitatively, these are important things, and if you are a monetary theorist or a monetary policy maker, you really, really want to care a lot about the micro heterogeneity, because the zero lower bound links micro heterogeneity with aggregate outcomes of monetary policy in a very concrete way. Even, as I was saying before, as a central banker, you hate people that are poor. Even if you hate them, you still care about what happens with them because it will matter for your objectives of inflation and output stabilization. Yes?
Quick question. So for your model, I can understand that for the Taylor rule, for intercept, use the rate that gives you like the
Yeah.
stabilizes the inflation at the non-stochastic steady state,
Yes.
right? But that automatically means that the central bank kind of
Yeah.
stabilizes around like the
Yeah.
wrong thing. So how would be the
Yes.
consequence be different if the central bank is kind of
Okay.
more sophisticated, understands what
So
kind of
no, that's a great point, and that's something I have tried to make in several papers. So somehow people think that the first moment of the model in the deterministic steady state is informative. The answer is a few times it is, but there is a lot of situations where it's not. And I have tried to talk with a fair number of central bankers and tell them, no, you want to think about the ergodic distribution.
Yes.
You don't want to think about just steady state.
Yes.
And I have not been able to make that point. I somehow, and I have a paper in American Economic Review that says this matters a lot if in an open economy. And I have a paper in Review of Economic Studies saying this matters a lot. And the papers have a fair number of citations. So it's not that the profession has not listened to them, but somehow central bankers don't think about this.
Yeah.
So it's not targeting 2% in the steady state. It's very different than targeting 2% in the ergodic distribution. And you need to be aware of it. And I don't know. Maybe we need to
Ben
go on.
Bernanke could understand this if he would.
I don't know. Maybe we need to teach a class on ergodic theory for central bankers. I don't know. You guys in the DSE, maybe that can be. I don't know.
One quick last.
Yes, and I stop.
I know it's rational to have proportionate savings if you are poorer. Is that also true is that also observed?
Okay.
There empirical.
I'm the guru of precautionary. Yes.
Yes.
I'm the guru of precautionary savings. Yes.
And remember that.
Worry a lot.
Yeah, worry.
And they do things. And sorry, those just say, yeah, okay. They do things.
Yes.
Precautionary savings matters for poor people. I'm the guru, okay? Of precautionary savings. Poor people do things that matter a lot for their ability to smooth consumption because of their precautionary motives. So, full stop.
Yeah. Okay, sorry, I ran over, but I'm happy to answer more questions later.
Thank you.